Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. On today's program, Is America Great Again with Donald Trump in the White House, as he promised in his campaign? Our guest, Eugene Puryear, author, activist, and organizer of the A.N.S.W.E.R coalition. Eugene Puryear, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Eugene, is America great again?
I think that America is not great again, as Donald Trump promised, from the point of view of maybe those who were curious about him, who thought, well, we could rebuild our country, the infrastructure of this country. 1 in 9 bridges in America could collapse at any time, which gives you a sense of how bad it is. So there are some people who thought, yes, maybe we would rebuild the country, maybe we would withdraw from some of the foreign wars we're in. We haven't seen much of that. But for a core of Donald Trump's base of more conservative people with racially biased views, we have seen for them some strong improvements and moves along the ideas, the policy ideas they would like to see. So I think it depends on how you look at it in terms of which way we are headed right now.
Do you remember that recently he was retweeting some videos that were absolutely anti-Muslims? And the reading of the criticism was that he is basically exacerbating xenophobia, racism. Is that what happened in the first year?
Oh, I think so, absolutely. I mean, we saw it from the very beginning when Donald Trump tried to initiate what he called a travel ban, but which seemed to be aimed almost only at countries that have a Muslim majority. We've seen it with the treatment of immigrants in this country, where there's been an attempt to really force people back into the shadows. You have not only huge increases in organizations like ICE, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement, taking in larger numbers, but you can also see them doing things like following people when they drop their kids off to school and then arresting them, and other sorts of outrageous activities like that. We've also seen it from him saying when Nazis marched in Charlottesville, Virginia, that there were some good people among them. So I think really from beginning to end in this first year of the Trump administration, major increase in hate crimes, in bigotry, in xenophobia, and in racism.
Talking about racism, what about justice? Is the U.S. justice just?
I think that the justice system here in the United States is as broken from the point of view of actually providing justice as it really has ever been. I mean, we continue to see, we just saw, for instance, a story in this fall, this year, of one state in the United States, Louisiana, where a number of prisoners aren't even allowed to have attorneys. And this is a constitutional right of something that has to happen. So it gives you a sense of how eroded this sense of justice is when even the most basic precepts, like everyone having the right to an attorney, like we have here in the United States, aren't being met because of fiscal and financial burdens of really states and politicians not being willing to get the correct funding from the wealthier individuals and allowing others to suffer.
How the African American community is treated in facing the justice?
The African American community disproportionately arrested, even for the same crime. You see especially many drug crimes, but even many quote unquote violent crimes where a black person and a white person will be accused of the same thing. Black people are almost always likely to be convicted and to be sentenced to higher sentences. And overall, we're facing in every major city in America mass epidemics of black people being stopped on the street unjustly, searched unjustly, and that leads to many, many, many very tragic, devastating stops where people are murdered, frequently about 1,000 people a year, by the police here in the United States.
So how would you assess democracy in the U.S. after the first year of Donald Trump at the White House? Better, worse, same?
I would say it's worse. I would say we see really in many ways democratic precepts starting to slip away here in the United States.
Like for example, what?
Well, for one example, you have Donald Trump having a quote unquote voter fraud commission, something that's never been proven, which really seems to be designed actually to reduce the number of people voting. So even at the most basic level, we're seeing the heart of so much of democracy going to the ballot box being eviscerated for many people, African American people, and others in this country in major ways. And that's just one thing.
Donald Trump says that his major accomplishment in terms of legislation has been what he calls the tax reform. In reality, the criticism is that it's not a reform, it's mostly a tax reduction. For example, Bernie Sanders mentioned some highlights. He said 80% of the reduction goes to the 1%. 40% goes to the 1/10 of 1%. 1/3 of the middle class is going to end up paying more taxes. On the other hand, Donald Trump says this is the greatest accomplished in about decades, and it's going to create jobs. Who's right, who's wrong?
Well, I think Senator Sanders is right here. Even Congress's own bipartisan analytical body found that this would not, in fact, create enough economic growth to even cover the cost of the revenue that it is losing.
They're talking about $1 trillion to increase
We're talking
the
about
deficit.
$1 trillion, and that means that there's going to be cuts to social programs. It also means that it's not going to create that many jobs, which, quite frankly, is a piece of what we're seeing from the IMF, from the OECD, who are also saying that growth is going to be slower. The country is not going to create as many jobs as it needs. So I think Senator Sanders is much more correct here than President Trump.
And we're talking about like 15 to 20 million, depending on the assessment, of Americans are going to lose their medical insurance.
Absolutely. They're going to lose their medical insurance because it'll eliminate the individual mandate. And also, in addition, premiums will go up. So healthcare for many people will actually start to cost more, which also could cause some employers to kick even more people off health insurance because they don't want to cover it. So yet another example of how healthcare in America is treated completely as a commodity. And if you don't have enough money, you don't have access to health.
So remember that the discussion among Barack Obama and John McCain in an election, the two candidates, Barack Obama says healthcare is a right. McCain said it's a privilege. What is it?
It looks like at this stage in the game, it is a privilege, and that Republicans, including President Trump, are doing everything possible to eviscerate the right to health care to the extent that it existed under the Affordable Care Act.
So basically in the U.S., healthcare is a commodity, as it's a commodity education and it's a commodity housing, and it's basically extremely hard for most of the Americans to take care of that.
Absolutely. It's just like housing, just like so many other social needs in America. Your ability to access it is determined by your ability to pay for it, which means that many, many people either go without or go with significantly healthcare that's significantly under what the true quality should be for someone to actually take care of themselves.
So if you're watching this from other parts of the world, and you're seeing that the middle class is losing ground, as Bernie Sanders most definitely says. In the last 40 years, it's going downhill. What happened that the American people do not react? How come? Is that the love of the Stockholm syndrome?
I think some of it is confusion when you have people like Donald Trump just absolutely lying.
But I do think that 300 million people,
well,
and it cannot be confusion in terms of that is taking place since many, many years. How come the American people is accepting that 1% of their population rules their destiny in a way that goes against their will? Please explain to people who are watching this and sees there's no logic except that something is extremely weird.
Well, I think what people should look, who are looking from the outside in, should see is that I don't know if it's so much as people are accepting it as they're resigned to it, that they have just determined that this is what's going to happen, that they are powerless inside of this system. They see that the politicians are bought and paid for, and they've lost confidence.
But the national anthem is talking about that this is the land of the brave. Mm-hmm. How brave are the people who let themselves be hostage of the 1%?
Well, I think that we've seen that many people don't really agree with the national anthem here in the National Football League and are starting to fight back
sing it
in
every
different
day.
ways. Well, some people are, some people aren't.
Yeah, but they sing it at school, everybody.
Yeah, well, I think we're just going to have to see here, but I think it's undeniable to say that there have been rising social movements in the United States challenging power, challenging capital. Well, I think that we've seen something. Well, I think that it hasn't changed things yet, but I think that ultimately you can't necessarily say that just because
nothing has changed.
Well, I wouldn't say that nothing has changed exactly.
For example, what? As Bernie Sanders is saying, the middle class is going downhill. What is going in
Sure,
terms
but
of
what was it that brought that middle class and allowed things like that to happen? I mean, well, there were many things, of course, U.S. imperialism abroad, but the growth of the union movement in the United States, for example, which was something that has now eroded, which has played a role in the reduction of living standards here in the United States. And it's things like this that I think
you're not giving me an answer
that
that is convincing people watching this from outside.
Well,
what is the state of democracy if the people is not ruling the country?
Well, I think the state of democracy is clearly eroded. I do not think that the United States is operating in a democratic
is this a democracy?
No, I think it's an oligarchy. I mean, I think you can see from the way money controls politics and the way that really in every single way those who are the wealthiest individuals and corporations, like with this tax plan, are essentially able to get whatever they want from the political system. I think we see that really there is a deep democratic deficit in the country.
Why not to call the domestic terrorism when you're living in the U.S.?
Well, I think we should call it domestic terrorism.
Why it's not being called?
I think it's not being called domestic terrorism primarily for the purposes of racism and bigotry. I think that the authorities in this country are very invested in the word terrorism only being associated with Muslim people, Arab people, South Asian people, and to admit that the most people who have been killed in terrorist attacks here in America are actually killed by neo-Nazi terrorists would undermine that. When these mass shootings are done by many white individuals or at least non-Muslim seeming individuals, that undermines that. And to wage the wars that we're waging abroad, I think it's very important for the military-industrial complex and the politicians to create the mindset that terrorism is only something that's over there.
If domestic terrorism practiced by white people, U.S. citizens, is not being called domestic terrorism in the mass media, 6 corporations control the information agenda of 94% of Americans. About 300 million Americans receive messages from 6 large corporations. The fact that it's not being called domestic terrorism done by U.S. citizens, means that the mass media is part of the problem and not part of the reporting and the solution?
Well, I think that's certainly true. I think what we see with the media here is they are complicit in having the same biases and believing some of that, well, either believing or being complicit in producing a lot of that same propaganda that leans in that direction.
And because of?
And I think it's because of a few things. I think one, it's because they believe in the ultimate underlying facet there, that the problems that exist within America can't be classified as quote unquote terrorism for whatever reason. I think beyond that though, I think that they are also complicit in the war making apparatus. They assume in their most basic sense that the wars abroad are basically good, basically just. That's why they can write articles about the military losing trillions of dollars and never once question what it's actually being spent on. And I think that what we see here is that they are willing to reinforce the exact same narratives because they bring the same exact biases to the table in terms of how we conceive of terrorism, how it's really put primarily on a certain subset of people and then is used to create an enemy that we are building up this massive military machine for interventions.
So
around.
the mass media is at the service of the interests of the large corporations or of the American public?
I think they're in the service of the interests of large corporations, and they themselves are large corporations.
When you're watching American TV, for example, the largest media, mass media, repeatedly you hear that, for example, a foreign network called RT, Russia Today, every time that they refer to RT, they mention that is the quote-unquote propaganda machine of the Kremlin. My question to you is, and the 6 corporations mass media isn't the machine of the large corporations and could be as bad or worse or what?
No, I think they are the machine of the large corporations, and it could be worse. I mean, if you look at American media, which has funded the big media, all by advertising. So their entire business model is based on trying to trick and cajole and inculcate people to buy all of these different types of corporate products and support different brands and the like. And so just their very existence is really as an institution of propaganda for corporations. And then beyond that, they themselves, by the news that they are putting out, the way they're reporting it, or what they are not reporting, do in fact reinforce the agenda of the broad agenda, I think, of the U.S. abroad, which is one of pursuing a certain global dominance to further the corporate agenda and commerce and so on.
You were mentioning war at a certain point. Is war a business or is an quote-unquote necessity to defend principles such as democracy, justice, and so on and so forth?
Oh, I think it's a business. I think when you look at the way that it's waged and all the war crimes that are committed, I mean, even just this past summer with the U.S. having the offensive in Iraq, I mean, certainly you hear all that about ISIS, but you didn't hear about the hundreds of civilians that the United States was killing in these airstrikes really wantonly. And you start to think, why is the U.S. invading? You look at Libya, you look at Iraq, you look at Somalia, so many places that we've invaded and destabilized, the problems have gotten worse and worse and worse, and certainly freedom, justice, democracy, and liberty were not the result. So there must have been some other goal and some other agenda.
Do you think that Joseph Spack, the American average citizen, gets the idea that this is a business, war is a business, or the military industry is a business, and not really what they are painting on the mass media?
I think so. I think that if you look at, there's actually been some interesting studies, in fact, in the election where Donald Trump, even though he has not carried this out, was pretending that he was going to pull back from some of the wars. And a certain subset of professors have studied this, and they found that in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, which were the states which perhaps tipped the election to Mr. Trump, that from their analysis, about 1.5% of the vote, enough to turn the vote, were people who were very concerned because their counties had some of the highest casualty rates in some of these wars abroad. So I think even though it's not widely reported by the media, I think it is having an effect on the politics of the country. And I think that's why Donald Trump lied to exploit that sentiment amongst people.
Do you remember that candidate Trump, when he was precisely in the campaign mentioning, I'm not going to interfere, I'm not going to put my nose in another countries of the world. And we have seen, for example, in Latin America, talking really in a very disrespectful way and very with tough criticism to any country that has a progressive government. So he's putting the nose in all over the world.
He is. He's lying completely, which it's worth noting. So did George Bush, and so did Barack Obama. I mean, every president always comes in saying that they are going to correct the bad foreign policy mistakes. And the past 3 or 4 presidents have said they were going to draw back U.S. troops. None of them have. And in Latin America, I think we've seen really from the Bush era on that there's been a concerted attempt to crush any progressive movements and any progressive governments there in Latin America. And it seems the Trump administration has elevated this concern and really, in fact, empowered the most jingoistic, pro-imperialist sections of the Congress, the Marco Rubios of the world, to pursue their agenda.
So Bernie Sanders is saying most definitely the huge corporations are donating, are buying the senators. So the Congress here in Washington is bought by the large corporations and they're puppets of their interests?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I just mentioned Mr. Rubio from Florida, something people can look into. They should look at the Fanjul family, a big, powerful agribusiness sugar industry that they're flying these politicians around to these Dominican Dominican Republic vacations. You have the Koch brothers who are bringing together these big, giant parties of billionaires where they're bringing the politicians in to speak, even people as high as Vice President Mike Pence. You know, President Trump, the same day that the tax reform passed in the Senate, he actually went to speak to 3 separate fundraisers that night of the super and ultra rich. I mean, money is everywhere in American politics.
Noam Chomsky has said that in the U.S. there are no 2 political parties. It's just one party, the business party. Is he right?
I think he's 100% right. I mean, all you have to do is look at the corporate donations, which almost evenly split between the 2 parties, except with the exception of certain industries. I think you can look at even Barack Obama, when he reformed healthcare, what was the first thing he did? Is he brought in the big hospital companies, he brought in the big pharmaceuticals, and he made sure they got their money, and so they would then support his broader efforts. So I think we see it from both major parties that their broad agenda is to push forward the agenda of the bigger, larger businesses in this country.
And how you could explain that there are no, throughout the years, there is no rise of new parties, third parties, or, I mean, there are a few smaller countries, but they get less than 5%, and therefore the presidential commission that decides the debates has put as a rule that if you don't have 5% of the vote intention, you cannot participate. It's sort of a catch-22. Why not the race of another parties?
Well, I think that's a good point you make about the debates. There's a huge amount of undemocratic hurdles to even get involved in the elections. They want people to collect huge amounts of signatures before anyone knows who they are. You have situations like this where when the U.S. goes abroad and tells other countries how to run their elections, they say you should have up to 8 candidates in the debate. Here in the United States, they don't even want to let 3 or 4 candidates in the debates, and they exclude them based on arbitrary things, oftentimes even before there's been opinion polls or money raised or anything like that, just an assumption of who will do well and who won't. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's often fees and other things that are involved. And then you have a winner-take-all, first-past-the-post style of system, which makes people feel that, well, I don't have as much of a chance if I can't get as many people with me. So even though we say we have a democratic process of elections here in the United States, there are so many different factors and hurdles and laws that make it very difficult to even get on the ballot for people to hear what you have to say and perhaps grow as a political party, which make it very, very difficult.
Talking about the drug war. In Latin America, there is this skepticism that in reality the U.S. is not really there to combat the narco traffic. It's there to put their nose through the military in that region.
I think that's 100% true. I think people in Latin America should be skeptical of the U.S. war on drugs. I mean, first and foremost, the fact that the United States is using our money and military equipment in Latin America when we are the #1 consumers of the product should tell you something right there, is that they're trying to offload the blame for a problem onto the place that really isn't the blame the problem. But on top of that, we see that in this country that all of the elements that they claim are used to combat the war on drugs have done nothing to actually reduce the use of drugs.
Money laundering.
Money laundering. You see the big banks are consistently, every major bank in America in the past 5 or 6 years has been hit with the drug money laundering charge. They never go to jail, they pay a fine, they keep moving, but average everyday people, especially Black and Latino people, are in and out of jail, constantly making up the bulk of those in jail, oftentimes for these small, non-violent drug crimes.
Precisely, you were talking about the situation in the prisons, and you're talking about that in the case of African Americans, a large percentage of them are there just because of small crimes, and also you're talking about private prisons and the business.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, you have so many people on small crimes, and now you have the growth of the past 20 years of these private prisons that not only do they specialize in having whole prisons that are private, but they also now specialize in ankle monitors for people who are released on probation and parole. They work in all sorts of different bail and other industries to privatize things.
For the audience, U.S., 5% of the world population, 25% of people in jail. On top of that, you mentioned 7 million Americans on probation or parole.
Exactly, and we have the largest prison
Something
problem
is very wrong.
Something is very, very wrong, and especially when you see many of these people on, as I said, non-violent drug crimes. You have people who have mental illnesses who instead of getting help are actually then being locked up. You have people with drug addiction problems who instead of getting treatment are instead being locked up. We take so many social problems in America and we criminalize them, and it leads us to having millions and millions of people in prison and all sorts of terrible assorted effects on the communities like the African American community that are disproportionately affected.
Do you believe that Donald Trump is on to end his term because there are already studies in the Congress that he could have done obstruction of justice? What do you think?
I think he will finish his term. I think it's very difficult to prove that a president has met the threshold for impeachment. I think that it's often something that becomes more divisive, and even the opposition party doesn't benefit politically as much as they'd like. I think as much as there'll be a lot of talk about impeachment, I think the Democrats at the end of the day will remember how the Clinton impeachment in many ways turned against the Republicans and helped Democrats, and will fear that and will not push aggressively for the impeachment of Donald Trump. But it's certainly possible, but I expect him to finish his term.
Eugene Puryear, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Follow the most important global events through a comprehensive perspective. A team of journalists in 25 locations around the world. 3 broadcasts to convey our people's reality. From the South. Weekdays. Only on A.N.S.W.E.R.
Our people, our ethnicities, Latin America and the Caribbean united, because our North is the South.
A.N.S.W.E.R is branching out into new territories to democratize information. It's an insight into the world from a South American perspective.
We now broadcast live in English, and we want to share with you interviews with the region's most prominent figures. Reports that highlight resistance and resilience, and in-depth analyses of political and social realities in Latin America and the Caribbean and the rest of the world.
Join us as we build a new communications model that serves to promote the integration of our people. Only on A.N.S.W.E.R. The Pakistani journalist Tariq Ali examines the mass media influence promoted by imperialism. Get access to the analysis of the socio-economic and political life of the whole South America on our screen and platform in English. A critical place committed to the truth to determine the major events that transformed the world today. On Monday, only on A.N.S.W.E.R. A sign of resistance to hatred and injustice, Bill Fletcher Jr. conducts a discussion and analysis space to reveal the social struggles of Black people on the global Africa. Wednesdays, only on A.N.S.W.E.R. Closely follow the most important facts around the world with a wholesome view. We offer you to be where the news are happening with our team of 25 correspondents deployed around the globe. Live and experience the realities of our people from the South. Weekdays, only on A.N.S.W.E.R. Events told by their main figures. Research findings that transcend our people's views.
Monsanto se ve entre un buen sector de los agricultores como una gran amenaza.
Hay un montón de gente que se va a España a trabajar, a otro sitio a trabajar. No tienes que estar aquí siempre para que ayude a tu pueblo.
Desde entonces estoy buscando a mi nieto. Por gente liberada, he sabido que es un varón. Hace poco ha cumplido 6 años. Alguien lo tiene.
No somos simples estudiantes que venimos, entramos, escuchamos la clase de un profesor y después nos levantamos y nos vamos, sino que entendemos lo que pasa y sobre todo tenemos que ser sujetos de cambio frente a lo que pasa y tenemos que tener un rol en nuestra educación y en nuestra sociedad.
A.N.S.W.E.R. Report on Monday, only on A.N.S.W.E.R. An occasion to enjoy the cultural diversity that defines our South American essence. Come along to find out the story behind these personalities, traditions, and artistic expressions that unite us as a whole. Real Lives. Saturdays, only on A.N.S.W.E.R. Our actions have an impact on the environment. It's our responsibility to change for the sake of our planet. Let's be part of this transition. Watch, preserve, and protect your green zone. Wednesdays, only on A.N.S.W.E.R. A.N.S.W.E.R. features the developments of science and technology that innovate and make the world go around.
Eso es Átomo, transmitimos desde América Latina. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas.
Technology available to everybody. Atomo. Mondays, only on A.N.S.W.E.R. Our actions have an impact on the environment. It's our responsibility to change for the sake of our planet. Let's be part of this transition. Watch, preserve, and protect your green zone. Wednesdays, only on A.N.S.W.E.R.